So I'm now going to hand over to Joe Tyndall, who is our speaker for today. Just a quick reminder for everyone to pop themselves onto mute, please, if you can, when you join us. And I will start sharing Joe and be your glamorous assistant.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, Sarah, are you okay to share the slides as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So, morning, everyone. I'm Jo Tyndall, and I am an employment law specialist and partner at national law firm Gunnar Cook. I'm based in West Yorkshire, just up the road from Sarah, which is how we got to know each other. And I have a particular interest in, as well as employment law and I guess the trickier end of things, also employee wellbeing and bereavement support. And some of that partially comes from my own journey in terms of bereavement and my own experiences. And so I'm conscious that many of us obviously have a grief or a bereavement story. And I guess just to touch on mine briefly, because I think it is useful in the context of what we're talking about today. I lost around 2.5 years ago when I was actually on adoption leave. So at the time that I was welcoming a 2.5-year-old little girl into our lives, I lost my mum due to cancer. So you can imagine how traumatic and tricky that time was for me. And I have to say that my Gunnar Cook were fantastic. They were really supportive. I had a great team of colleagues, and it was just the right level of support, really. But obviously, I would say that at that time I was off work. So, you know, I had the time in some ways. Obviously, I was also off work for the purposes of adoption. But my partner was off at the same time as me, and it did give me that breathing space in terms of the aftermath and also the end of life care. And obviously, there are a lot of people who aren't in that situation. So I do think this is a really important thing to start talking about. And we're seeing it more and more, aren't we, coming into focus, which is fantastic. I think the other thing I'd mention is that from a personal point of view, I've also experienced loss in other ways, as many people have. It's not just about death. I've experienced loss in terms of IVF failure, and that's something that's becoming more and more talked about, which is great. So when we're talking about bereavement and loss, obviously it's a wider conversation than, you know, just death in some contexts. And that's something also that's worth thinking about and that I'll touch upon when we talk about bereavement policies. Of course, grief is a very unique experience to everyone, but it affects the vast majority of employees at some point during their working life. Next slide, please, Sarah. Next slide, please, Sarah. Thank you. So I think today's session is really about raising awareness in terms of the impact of bereavement at work and looking at what employers can do to offer support, including by having an effective bereavement policy, but also other practical measures. There's absolutely no point having a policy if it isn't supplemented by practical measures, such as making sure that managers are equipped to properly deal with these issues and having more open conversations about grief in the workplace. There is a growing movement for change. We've seen organisations like Cruise, Bereavement, lobbying for change, and also the UK Commission for Bereavement, which has come into existence over the last few years, which I'll touch upon. And they've come up with some important recommendations for the future, which we'll have a look at. Next slide, please, Sarah. So if we start by having a look at some research by the Funeral Guide, which I'm sure some of you will already be aware is a leading online funeral resource in the UK. So according to the Funeral Guide, 1 in 10 employees are coping with grief at any one time, and 77% of employees have experienced a bereavement. We've also had the impact of COVID, which I'm sure all of us are acutely which has really brought the need for bereavement support into sharp focus, with 1.2 million people dying due to COVID or COVID-related effects, and 6.8 million people being bereaved as a consequence in 2020 and 2021, which is quite staggering, really, if we think about the fact that really an awful lot of those people will still be grieving, as grief is clearly an ongoing process and not something that just affects people for a period of time following death. As I'm sure many of us will appreciate, death is not something that our society finds easy to talk about, and I suppose by that I mean Western society. It can be uncomfortable to have conversations about death. People might see it as being morbid or something to get over, rather than as a natural process, in which it's viewed in many different societies across the world. And obviously what goes on in work is often a microcosm of society, isn't it? And we spend a lot of time in work, which means it's really important that we start to get a handle on this. I think there is now increasing focus on talking about grief. The UK Commission for Bereavement produced a report and recommendations in 2022. And that report was based on 130 organisations and over 1,000 employees providing views and sharing evidence. And it resulted in a 250-page report on all aspects of bereavement support, not just in relation to the workplace, but it gave some useful recommendations in relation to workplace support, which we'll look at in a bit. For those of you who aren't familiar, the UK Commission for Bereavement is formed from a number of prominent organisations across the UK, including Marie Curie and Cruz, as well as a number of academic organisations. And it exists to look at this issue and to lobby for change in particular. Next slide, please, Sarah. So I think this quote really highlights that grief is, of course, different for everyone, and it's an ongoing state which can ebb and flow, and that needs to be reflected in support at work. So the emotional impacts of grief vary and are changeable over time, often lasting for many months and years in different forms. Next slide, Sarah. So in terms of where we are now, this slide just highlights a number of other factors which are relevant in terms of how bereavement is impacting in the workplace. We have, of course, got an ageing population, which in turn means an ageing workforce. There are pressures to work for longer, and indeed, in many cases, a desire to work for longer. So people are working for longer. It's predicted that the increase will be to 20% of the workforce by 2024 will be aged 65 or over, and 25% by 2024, which is really a huge chunk of the working population. So this, of course, means that loss and bereavement will affect more and more employees as more of us stay in work for longer. And it's also likely that it will have a knock-on effect in relation to caring responsibilities. So I know that when I went through the loss of my mum at a time when I had caring responsibilities, and still do, obviously, for a young daughter, I also then had increased caring responsibilities for my father, and it really emotional support that was upon me was significantly increased. And I expect that is the case for many people who have those two forms of caring responsibilities, both for parents and for children. And of course, it's not unique to a situation where someone is bereaved. It's also a natural consequence of the fact that we're working for longer, and therefore people in the workforce may well have elderly parents with caring responsibilities as well as young children. I think another factor which is really relevant here is that we now have new ways of working, don't we? And whilst they can be great and fantastic, home working can be a brilliant thing if it's operated well and communication is good. It can also be quite isolating if it doesn't work in that way, and that can only be exacerbated in times of grief, which can be isolating in themselves. So it's important that we think about that in the context of support when employees are going through bereavement. Next slide, please, Sarah. So earlier on, I mentioned that the UK Commission on Bereavement had produced a report, and part of that report looked at ratings of support from employers. And this was the finding. So on the face of it, 43% of responders said that they felt very well supported. So on the face of it, that looks not bad, I would say. But obviously, it still indicates that over 50% of responders felt that they could have been supported better. So there's still work to do. And obviously, with any survey, it's reliant on the responses which are received. Next slide, please, Sarah. So this was some research done by the Funeral Guide. I've put pre-pandemic there. I couldn't actually quite work out when the research was carried out, but it does look to have been before the pandemic. And this presents something of a gloomier picture in terms of support and employees' perceptions. So this research indicated that 71% of employees were unaware of bereavement policies in the workplace. Only 6% of employees say their employer made the workplace bereavement policy clear to them, which is quite shocking, really. 54% of employees would have preferred more time off or a phased return after a bereavement. Just 21% of women and 12% of men felt their employer listened to them when they needed it. We're going to talk about listening a bit more in due course. And many felt their employers were unsure about how to help them after they returned to work. And I think this is a really key one, isn't it? It comes back to the difficulty that many people have in talking about grief, and the fact that it isn't a feature of training. It's not something that is specifically trained on in the workplace. As far as I'm aware, I have not come across any employers where this is a specific feature. That might reflect the fact that I tend to act for smaller businesses, SMEs, where budgets are naturally limited, and it may well be that this is something which is a nice to have rather than viewed as a essential at the moment. Next slide, please, Sarah. So on this slide is a quote from a woman in her 50s whose daughter died from cancer, and it appears in the UK Bereavement Commission report, which came out, I think, last year. It's, I think, an example of all the things that we want to avoid, or employers want to avoid. Also illustrates this problem with not really knowing how to manage bereavement at work. So she says, when I rang my boss to tell him my daughter was in the hospice and I was taking the rest of my annual holiday, he asked me how long I would be away for. And I had to point out that I didn't know how long it would take her to die. I only got 5 days paid leave. At the end of that time, we hadn't even got a date for the funeral. When I did get back to work, my colleagues had all been told not to talk about my daughter's death in case it upset me. So no one mentioned my darling girl. I felt like a ghost drifting aimlessly through the office with no one noticing me. I mean, it's really quite emotional. So yes, it's a stark example there, but I think one worth highlighting. And as the UK Bereavement Commission points out in their report, inadequate support in the workplace increase the risk of poor outcomes in all areas of a person's life, including mental health, long-term employment prospects, and economic prospects. Next slide, please, Sarah. So as a result of its report, which I would encourage you to have a look at, particularly the summary section, which is fairly easy to read and available on their website, specifically in relation to the workplace, the UK Bereavement Commission came up with Principle 2, which is, I am sensitively supported by my school, college or workplace during my bereavement. So that is what they are looking for in terms of change, sensitive support. And, you know, there's not a long list of things that are expected. It really is focused on the type of support which is received in the workplace. Next slide, please, Sarah. So, as I'm a lawyer, obviously I do need to talk a bit about the law, and these are, this slide really highlights where we are at the moment in terms of legal requirements. So at the moment, there's no standalone legal right to bereavement leave unless it relates to the death of a child under the age of 18, in which case there's a right to 2 weeks statutory leave, currently at £156.66 per week, or 90% of pay if lower, and that is increasing to £172.48 per week from 1st of April. So obviously that's not a great deal, and for most people it will be nowhere near covering the final financial loss they would experience, even when you're looking at the death of a child. In relation to a pregnancy where there is a stillbirth after 24 weeks onwards, that would trigger maternity, paternity or adoption leave rights. So in the same way as if a child was born prematurely in that situation, specific rights are triggered under the family leave legislation, which would mean, for example, that a mother would be able to have the entire maternity leave period. But that's only for stillbirths after 24 weeks. So for miscarriage before 24 weeks and for, you know, IVF failure, for example, again, there's no right to leave. There are also rights relating to ill health and death of a dependent. So these are rights to unpaid leave to deal with immediate logistics and care arrangements. So again, they're rights to unpaid leave, and it tends to just be for immediate emergency situations. So other than that, it really is a matter of discretion for the employer as to the level of support given. I think in terms of those rights, if you want to look at any of it in more detail, then go to the ACAS website. I'm not particularly good at quoting chapter and verse of this type of law. It's quite detailed and quite procedural. But the ACAS website, which I've quoted on that slide, and I believe the slides will be sent out afterwards, gives a lot of detail about of those particular rights. So go and have a look at that if that would be helpful. Next slide, please, Sarah. So why should employers consider offering more support? Well, I think as well as obviously it being the right thing to do, there are legal and business reasons for offering more support, which go beyond what I've talked about already. So I'm talking here about wider legal duties towards employees. So firstly, there's a duty of care to safeguard the health, safety and welfare of staff. So this is a general duty which applies cross-employment. And essentially, if there's a breach of this duty and it results in an employee's health being compromised in some way, so they suffer some kind of personal injury, a mental health illness, for example, then potentially an employer can be liable for that. So that's something to think about. There's then this duty of mutual trust and confidence. So essentially what this says is that an employer must not act in a way that destroys trust and confidence in the relationship. And that would include ensuring that reasonable steps are taken to support employees at work, which could include a period of bereavement. So that's something that's worth thinking about. Typically, what I tend to see is claims in relation to trust and confidence resulting in people leaving and saying that they've been forced out, in which situation there may be claims for constructive dismissal, which is where things have got so bad and trust and confidence has broken down, and an employee can actually treat themselves as having been dismissed and leave their organisation. The other potential area is in relation to employees with disabilities. So It's important to be mindful that in some cases, loss and bereavement can unfortunately lead to a mental health issue, such as depression or anxiety, or post-traumatic stress, for example, which might amount to a disability under the equality legislation. If that's the case, then there is a duty to make reasonable adjustments to put that person on a level playing field, essentially, so to remove any disadvantage that they are suffering as a consequence. So it's important to be mindful of the impact on them of the loss or bereavement. And hopefully with the right support in the first place, the prospects of that happening will be reduced significantly. Also, from a business point of view, it clearly makes sense to offer support, obviously within the parameters of budgets and so on, which are available to businesses, but offering support in the first place, whilst it might feel that additional support is perhaps, a cost, it can in the longer term help reduce the risk and cost of sick leave, which is both a cost in itself and the management of it is time consuming and therefore costly. Dealing with performance issues potentially, dealing with mental health and disability issues, which is likely to require medical assessment and real time and energy put into management. And unfortunately also dealing with employment claims, which for those of you who've ever been in an employment tribunal situation, you'll know it's something which is to be avoided at all costs. So there's some sort of negatives to be avoided, but looking at the positives, doing this, it increases brand value, helps with retention and engagement levels. I had a look in doing my research for this session, and according to the Institute of Internal Communications, 77% of 18 to 34-year-olds would think about leaving a job if not given bereavement support. So it really is high on the agenda. And as an employer myself, I know that generation ask about flexible benefits packages. They're absolutely all over it. It's no longer just about the pay, the bottom line. They want to know all sorts about what you're offering. So it's becoming increasingly important, particularly at a time when retention is difficult. Next slide, please, Sarah. So how do you go about supporting bereavement? I've started with a bereavement policy. Many businesses already have a bereavement policy, which is great. Obviously, it's really, really good to have that as a starting point. But with any policy, it's important that it's fit for purpose, well publicised and regularly reviewed. In my view, as a minimum, a good policy should be clear, easy to follow and accessible. Particularly important as if we think about it, when this policy might be accessed, employees might be going through a period of considerable stress. They might be struggling to concentrate or focus. So that information really needs to be as clear as possible, and it may need walking through with them as well, or simplifying for them, in addition to it being in the policy itself. It should set out what relationships are covered. So, what relatives are covered, for example, whether friends are covered, but also I think not be too prescriptive. It's really, really important, isn't it? It might be that the policy says somebody else close to you, for example, because we can't be too prescriptive as to who might need to take leave under these policies, and having a general discretion is something that you should consider. It should make sure it's clear on the plan for support and time off, and signpost both external and internal help. I'll go on to have a look at internal help in a little bit more detail in a minute. And look not just at the immediate aftermath, but also longer term needs in relation to bereavement. Next slide, please, Sarah. So I think the amount of time off that you might allow is an important question. on the one hand, it's a cost to any business allowing time off on top of, say, annual leave or other time off rights. But on the other hand, as we've discussed, it's important that there is that ability to take time. The funeral guide suggests that many employers offer 3 to 10 days paid leave. In my experience, that feels about right from my clients and the kind of amount of compassionate leave they tend to offer, somewhere between 3 and 10 days typically. Question mark, is it enough? Well, I appreciate, we're operating in the real world here in terms of how much employers can afford to allow. When I had a look at whether or not there were employers who had more generous or different policies, I was operating obviously within time constraints in terms of how much research I could do. The only example I could find was Facebook, who offer 20 days paid leave at the moment. I think there's certainly a move in the States to offer unlimited time off, which covers not just holidays, but other needs for time off. And obviously what happens in the States tends to trickle through to this country. Now, there are pros and cons with that approach, which I'm not going to look at today. But certainly there is recognition in the States in terms of time off being allowed for bereavement. So in addition to the amount of time off, I think it's really worth thinking about flexibility in terms of the period that's allowed. So rather it being a set chunk of time after a bereavement, thinking about whether or not it can be taken flexibly over a longer period of time, for example. So, for example, days could be taken off around anniversaries or birthdays or other significant dates, or just if somebody's having a bad day, because anyone who's experienced grief will know that it ebbs and flows, as I've said already. So that kind of thing is something you could look at rather than it just being, 5 days off around the time of bereavement. And certainly my own experience was that, that time can easily be taken up with death admin, if you like, without even thinking about, coping with grief and that sort of thing in addition. Also think about pre-bereavement leave. So by that, I mean that, many people start to grieve when they find out someone close to them has a terminal illness, and actually that's the time that they might need some time off. Whereas immediately after the death, they get wrapped up in the arrangements, the immediate need for arrangements and so on. So it's just thinking about this sort of thing really, and not just having a fixed view of it, an amount of time off immediately following the death. Other things to consider, as I've mentioned already, miscarriages. So, I think any sensitive or caring employer would allow time off. It might well be that somebody who's had a miscarriage needs to have time off anyway as sick leave, but if not, think about how that works and what the interplay is between those policies, and also potentially IVF failure. So, having gone through IVF failure myself, it wouldn't have been something where I felt comfortable going to an employer and saying, this has happened to me, can I have some time off? Just wouldn't have felt able to do that. Admittedly, it was a while ago. If there's a policy which exists, which says you can have that time off, it just makes it that bit easier, perhaps then to go and say, oh, I've noticed you do this, can I take advantage of it? Rather than the employee having to make that approach in the first place. And I think another point, particularly for employers that can't allow or budget for additional paid leave, is allowing flexibility in things like taking annual leave, taking unpaid leave, allowing carryover, or taking from the next year's annual leave entitlement. So there are other things that can be done as well, in addition to the fact that sometimes it's not time off which is needed, but flexibility in working patterns. So the ability to temporarily alter a working pattern, start early, finish early, etc. In the short term when this is going on. Next slide, please, sir. So other factors to consider are making sure you give space for particular religious needs. So just having an awareness that certain religions may have particular mourning periods, for example. So there's an Islamic mourning period of 40 days. I know that for Judaism, quite often funerals happen very quickly after the death. So it's just being aware of the differences really in that regard. And not expected to have full knowledge, obviously, but if you're mindful of it, then that's the main thing, I think. And then providing for ongoing support beyond the initial period of bereavement and loss. So just some suggestions there. Having access to employee assistance programs, particularly relevant for the larger employees. Smaller employers might provide access to counselling, for example, or links with counselling organisations. Internal support. So I think this is a tricky one, because at the end of the day, it may well be that if you've lost somebody, there are only certain people you would feel comfortable talking to, and saying, oh, we have a bereavement champion isn't going to particularly help that individual, as they're not necessarily going to want to talk to someone they don't know about their loss. However, I do think there is a role for involving employees and management in talking about grief and loss more widely. And it might be that that's a role that champions or members of management can get involved in. It can be really powerful when someone at the very top of an organisation talks about their own personal experience of loss, because it then makes it okay for other people to talk about it. And a really good example of this is Sheryl Sandberg at Facebook, which probably leads into their leading policy. When she lost her husband in 2015, she said, amid the nightmare of Dave's death, I was grateful every day to work for a company that provides bereavement leave and flexibility. She was grateful every day. And I think that is, really important if you can engage senior management in sharing and perhaps showing some vulnerability to help others have more open conversations about what they are going through if they feel they want to do that. So signposting external support and charities, really important. At the last slide in my session, there are some links to external support. I'm sure there are many other links that could be obtained. These are just a few suggestions that I came up with. But yeah, please feel free to look at those. Making sure the interplay with other policies is clear. So things like maternity, parental leave, flexible working, time off for dependents, financial support, etc. So making sure your policy works properly and linking through to all those other policies. And making sure it's living and breathing and part of the compassionate overall culture. So, it's important that it doesn't just sit there, but it actually gets talked about and it becomes part of your overall values. And leading on from that, really important, obviously, is helping managers and colleagues to fully understand the grieving process. Next slide, please, Sarah. So the next few slides contain a number of points for managers or colleagues or businesses to consider when supporting bereavement. And it's really some tips that I've compiled through my own thinking and various resources online, all of which seem eminently sensible and sensitive to me. So initial conversations, and I suppose by initial conversations, I mean, it could be any point from when you become aware that an employee has a family member who perhaps has a serious illness, to when they become aware that that illness is terminal, to when you're told that they've suffered a bereavement. So in that initial conversation that you have, and obviously the earlier that happens, the better. And the more you talk to your employees and you know them, the better. And a lot of these things are common sense. So really it's about being sensitive to their needs at that time and not second guessing what somebody needs. asking what support they need, both emotional and practical. Practical is so important, particularly in the immediate aftermath or in terms of end-of-life care. And the UK Commission for Bereavement said that 61% of responders had difficulty with death admin following a bereavement. So at a time when, people should be grieving, it seems that an awful lot of people are preoccupied with death admin. My own experience was that delayed the grief process for me, because I was the one who had to take a lot of responsibility for funeral arrangements, writing the eulogy, all that sort of thing. So really, the grieving process was delayed, I would say, and also having to look after a, challenging 2.5-year-old. So it was only when she settled with us that I then began to grieve, I would say. And it's that sort of knowledge about your employees, which is good to have, isn't it? So other things to think about is time off or flexibility needed. Time off might not always be needed. Flexibility, consider religious needs. We've talked about this already. Another important point, what would the employee like to be communicated with colleagues? So how much do they want to be, do they want colleagues to be told? Being mindful of confidentiality and data protection from a legal point of view, but also just generally being sensitive. Arrangements for how they would like to be kept in touch with and workload cover. Looking possibly at home working. It might be they still want to work, but working from home would be better for them during that period of time. Then further support on an ongoing basis. So I've said on and around return to work, but obviously not all employees might take time off. So I would say that on an ongoing basis, keep checking in and asking what support is needed. Are any adjustments needed? Is a phased return needed when they come back to work? Keep checking in regularly. So if, as an employer, there already is a structure in place for one-to-one meetings, regular reviews, then this would naturally feed into this, but it may be, of course, that more regular check-ins is needed. Being mindful of the impact on health, both physical and mental, and signposting appropriate support on an ongoing basis. And I've put there specialists for loss of a child or suicide now, beyond the scope of this talk, but just to say that clearly what support is needed is going to depend on the situation. And there might be a need for, employers to do research or to help with that if that's not something the employee's already thought about or looked into. Next slide, please, Sarah. So some tips really for providing emotional support, and a few things which I've thought about are just making sure that time is given to people to talk about their loss if they wish to do so. Listening skills are obviously really, really important, and not offering unsolicited advice. Making sure that views are respected. So, for example, if an employee says they don't need time off or support, respecting that and not forcing the issue. Accepting and allowing emotional upset at work. So not being embarrassed about outbreaks at work. I would hope that doesn't happen, but again, I suppose it's one of those things where if you're not trained on it or you're not thinking about it, perhaps that could be the reaction. But also not expecting employees to be upset. Not all employees will be upset. Not everyone will react in that way, because grief is an individual experience, which might include factors such as the need to tell one's story over and over again, talk about the person that they have lost, other feelings which are obviously recognised in terms of the grief journey, including denial, anger, frustration, guilt, depression, withdrawal. I'm sure I'm teaching a number of people on this call to suck eggs when I'm talking about these kind of factors. But I think in terms of training managers at work and having that dialogue at work, it's important that all these sort of things are talked about in terms of, you know, tips for supporting in people going through bereavement. Being alive to the significance of potential triggers, so dates, occasions, places, etc. So I think it's a common view that people who've gone through a bereavement might suffer on anniversaries or birthdays, but that's not always the case. There can be other triggers. I know for myself personally, I struggle when I go into certain shops, or I you know, if I go to a charity shop in Ilkley, I'll think of my mum because she loved to go charity shopping. So it's that kind of thing, isn't it, really? It's not just necessarily about a particular birthday, but it might be. And don't forget their bereavement after a period of time. Research indicates that a lot of employees have said that initially there was a great deal of support, and then all of a sudden it would drop off. And then that person would never be mentioned again, the person they'd lost, unless they brought it up, which can be very difficult to do. So, you know, as I've said there, grief can be a lifetime affair. Next slide, please, Sarah. So what does the future have in store? The UK Commission on Bereavement 2022 report recommended as follows: that new legislation is brought into place requiring employers to have a bereavement policy. Two paid weeks off is allowed for all workers for all close relationships, and that there is government guidance for employers. So that would seem to me to be something that many employers are already doing, but it does at least take it further in terms of it being part of legislative. I'm not even going to try and say the word law if we move forward with those proposals. So the UK Commission is lobbying Parliament for change for the above. There isn't any clear indication of when those things might end up being implemented. As I'm sure we're all aware, the government's very busy with other things at the moment, so it could be some time before they reach the top of the agenda. I also saw that Cruise Bereavement are calling for greater training investment by organisations, so that might well be something that they push for. I think in summary, there are clearly compelling reasons to adopt a supportive approach now and before it becomes a requirement. And hopefully this session has given you some good ideas and tips as to how you might move forward if you are wanting to go down that route, or if you're advising on these issues.